The camera fades in on a massive academy building. Students are everywhere, rushing through hallways, whispering in groups, nervously checking their hands like they're expecting something to appear on their palms at any moment. There's an electricity in the air today that doesn't exist on normal school days. Today is Rank Test Day, and Rank Test Day at the National Awakener University is the closest thing this world has to Judgment Day. For most students, today will either define them or destroy them. For one student, today will do something the world has never seen before, but we'll get to that. First, let's talk about what this world actually is. This isn't your average school setting. The world Chen lives in has been fundamentally changed by the existence of what are called demon layers, essentially dungeons that randomly appear across the planet, filled with monsters of varying power levels. These layers range from the weakest F rank all the way up to the terrifying S rank, and inside every single one of them are monsters that would make your worst nightmares look like a pleasant afternoon nap. Now, humanity didn't just curl up and accept this. Certain people, roughly 1 in every 10,000, are born with the ability to awaken a special power. These people are called awakeners, and they are humanity's only real defense against the demon threats that pour out of these layers. Awakeners are classified by rank. Starting from the bottom, you've got E rank, the most common, the weakest, the ones who technically qualify as awakeners but are barely a step above a regular human. Then D rank, where things start getting interesting. Then C, B, A, and finally at the very top, S rank. An S rank awakener is a walking force of nature, a city-level threat walking around in human skin. The government knows this, the guilds know this, and because of that, S-rank potential is treated like national treasure. But here's the thing about awakeners. Having the potential to awaken means nothing if you can't actually grow your power. And growing your power requires fighting monsters inside demon layers, gaining experience, leveling up. It's basically a real-life RPG system, except dying means you actually die. The problem? Demon layers are controlled almost entirely by major guilds. Rich, powerful organizations that have long since monopolized access to these dungeons. If you're not connected, not wealthy, not already part of the system, you're locked out. You can have all the raw talent in the world, and it means nothing if you can never actually train. This is the world Chen was born into, and this is the world that, in another timeline, completely destroyed everything he loved. Let's back up, because before we talk about what Chen is today, we need to understand what Chen was. What he went through, what broke him, rebuilt him, and sent him back. In another life, the original timeline, Chen was nobody. He attended this exact same school, walked these same hallways, slept in this same dorm. And he failed. He didn't awaken. He graduated as a 0, someone who went through the entire Awakener education system and came out the other side with nothing to show for it. The bullying was brutal. Not the standard mean words in the hallway kind of bullying either. The real kind. The kind where a group of guys drag you to a sink and hold your head underwater just to see if pain might trigger your awakening. The kind where they watch you pass out and feel no guilt. In fact, they tell themselves they're doing you a favor, that they're helping. They weren't helping. Chen survived. But only barely, in more ways than one. And then, the world ended. Not metaphorically, literally. A demon layer that a top-tier guild was trying to conquer in the territory of Saint He country suddenly produced something that had never been seen before. A monster so powerful, it didn't register on any known scale. Something that called itself Wrath. The entire peak team of that guild, professionals, experienced fighters, people who had dedicated their lives to combat, were wiped out in seconds. Not defeated, not retreated, annihilated. And then Wrath walked out into the human world. What followed was the kind of horror that you can't fully describe because human language wasn't built to capture that level of loss. Wrath was the first demon lord, the most powerful of a class of monsters that shouldn't have been able to exist in the human world. But once Wrath opened the gates of hell, others followed. One after another, demon lords descended, each one more powerful than anything humanity had ever faced, each one bringing armies of monsters behind them. Cities fell. Countries crumbled, billions died, and somewhere in that apocalypse, Chen's sister, his only family, the person he had been silently protecting and living for, was killed right in front of him. He watched it happen. He couldn't stop it. Wrath killed her like she was nothing, like she was an obstacle on the road, not a person with dreams and a life and a brother who loved her more than anything in existence. Something broke in Chen that day, and something else, simultaneously, caught fire. He kept fighting, for years. Long after everyone else had given up, long after hope had become a foreign concept, Chen kept moving. He got stronger. He found ways to grow when there were no more systems, no more guilds, no more civilization to support him. He survived through sheer, grinding, relentless will. And eventually, after years of blood and loss and fighting, he found a way to kill the Demon King. Not defeat, not drive away, kill. The only way to do it was to self-destruct alongside him, a mutual destruction. Chen gathered everything he had, every last drop of power in his body, and detonated it directly against the Demon King. And then there was light. And then, nothing. And then, a ceiling he recognized. Chen opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling of his dorm room. His first thought was that he had died, obviously. Self-destructing tends to have that effect. His second thought was that the afterlife looked suspiciously similar to his university dormitory, which seemed like a strange architectural choice for whatever deity was running the show up there. Then he looked outside the window. People. Students walking around. The academy courtyard, alive and full of movement. Alive. All of them. Alive. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, like a picture slowly coming into focus. The familiar layout of the room. The way the light fell through the window at a specific angle he hadn't seen in a decade. The sound of someone talking in the hallway with a voice he thought he'd never hear again. He sat up. A holographic display appeared in front of him, something he had never seen in his previous life. Clean, organized, floating in the air like something out of a science fiction story. It informed him, in calm and clinical terms, that the integration of the power of gluttony had been completed. Chen stared at it. Then he looked back out the window, then back at the display. 10 years. He had gone back 10 years. He was sitting in his university dorm room, 10 years before the apocalypse, with a power in his body that he'd never had before, and with memories of everything that was coming. 3 years. That was how long he had before wrath descended. 3 years before the Demon Lord opened the gates. 3 years before the cascade of destruction that would eventually consume everything. 3 years to stop it. The weight of that, the sheer, crushing weight of having the knowledge of an apocalypse and the responsibility of preventing it, settled on his shoulders like something physical. But underneath the weight, there was something else too. His sister was alive. He could hear her voice if he called. He could see her face. He could protect her this time. Actually protect her. Not just watch helplessly while a monster that dwarfed his power erased her from existence. That thought alone was enough to get him moving. But before he could do anything, he needed to understand what he was working with. The system display that had appeared when he woke up wasn't something Chen recognized from his previous life. In that timeline, Awakeners were born with a single class, one specific type of power that defined everything about their fighting style. Some got warrior classes, others got mage classes, support classes, assassin classes. The variety was enormous, but the limit was absolute. One person, one class. That was the rule. Except for a tiny fraction of people who somehow manifested two classes. Dual classers were so rare they were essentially myths, walking treasures that every major guild desperately tried to recruit. You could count the known dual classers on one hand and still have fingers left over. Chen, in his previous life, had eventually awakened as a lightning assassin, a solid class, not the most powerful, but one that rewarded skill and speed, which suited him. He had pushed that single class to its absolute limit over years of desperate fighting. But this system, this gluttony system, was something else entirely. The concept was simple to understand and staggering in its implications. Chen could devour defeated enemies and absorb their classes, not learn them, not mimic them, actually absorb them into himself and use them as if they were his own, switching between them at will. It was, as he quickly realized, the same fundamental ability that the demon lord Lan Yu had wielded in his previous life, the demon that had given him the most trouble in his final battle. During that last fight, Lan Yu had transformed repeatedly, cycling through different monster forms, each one bringing different powers: dragon, poison creature, lightning beast. It had been the ability to absorb and use multiple classes that made that demon so dangerous, and now Chen had it. The implications rolled through his mind like waves. Every strong monster he defeated could become a new class. Every powerful ability he encountered could potentially be added to his arsenal. Where a normal awakener was limited to one class, or at absolute maximum 2, Chen had no ceiling. None. The limiting factor wasn't capacity. It was simply how many monsters he could defeat. Given what he'd been through in his previous life, that felt less like a limitation and more like an open invitation. Chen was still processing all of this when the door to his dorm room opened and Malong walked in. Malong, his roommate, his friend, the person who had been consistently kind to him in a world that hadn't been particularly interested in extending that kindness. He was an E-rank flower chanter, which put him solidly in the category of people that the more arrogant students at the academy wrote off as deadweight. His class was a support type, not flashy, not powerful in direct combat, not the kind of thing that got you recruited by major guilds. But Malong was genuine. In a school full of people performing strength, performing confidence, performing superiority, Malong was just himself. And in Chen's memory, that had always meant something. He had bandages on his cheek when he walked in, evidence of whatever had happened the day before. The bullying incident that Chen now remembered had put him in the infirmary in his original timeline. Malong had come to check on him then, just as he came to check on him now, the kind of person who shows up when other people don't. What Malong noticed immediately was that all of Chen's injuries had healed. This was not normal. Even awakeners, people with genuine supernatural power, didn't heal this fast. And as far as Malong knew, Chen hadn't even awakened yet. A non-awakener healing faster than a powered-up E-rank was medically impossible. He stared at Chen's completely unmarked face and forearms with obvious confusion. Chen gave him nothing. He'd need to be careful about how much he revealed and when. The gluttony ability, the ability to absorb classes from monsters, was not something he could afford to have public knowledge. The world was not kind to people who had power that other people wanted. He'd learned that the hard way in his previous life. Malong, because he was Malong, didn't push. He just reminded Chen that their rank test was scheduled for tomorrow, that they both needed to be ready, and that he felt bad because he knew Chen still hadn't awakened, and the rank test was extremely important for graduation. Chen just nodded, listening with the strange emotional vertigo that came from talking to someone you thought you'd lost forever. Malong had been murdered 3 days after Wrath descended in the previous timeline. An E-rank flower chanter against demon world monsters. The outcome had been inevitable and brutal. Not this time. The walk to prepare for the rank test took them through the kinds of social geography that defined life at the academy. The rich kids moved differently through these spaces. They owned them in a way that everyone else just visited. Gong Chung embodied this completely. The moment they ran into him, Chen felt the memory of every interaction with this person settle into his bones like cold water. Chung was the younger brother of Gong Ting, the student council president, the heir of one of the most powerful guilds in the country, the person currently sitting at the top of the academy's social food chain. Chung rode that connection like a wave, using his brother's name and reputation as a free pass to treat anyone weaker than him however he wanted. The altercation that followed was almost scripted. Chung and his lackeys appeared. Chung immediately established dominance through contempt, demanded that Malong bring him drinks, using money that wasn't Chung's for drinks that weren't Chung's, and when Malong began to apologize and comply, because that was just the path of least resistance that had kept him safe up until now, Chen stepped in. The one who should be apologizing here is actually you. Simple words, quietly delivered. But they landed in the social ecosystem of that hallway like a stone, thrown into still water. Chung turned. His expression went through several stages: confusion, disbelief, and then a cold, building fury. He wasn't used to this. His whole life had been organized around the principle that people below him in the hierarchy simply didn't push back. The hierarchy existed. The rules were understood. You didn't tell Gong Chung he owed anyone an apology. Students gathered. Pulled by the instinct that people have for conflict, the same instinct that makes them slow their cars past accidents. They expected the usual outcome: Chen getting beaten down, Malong apologizing, Chung walking away satisfied. What they got instead was something none of them had a category for. Chung threw a punch. Chen blocked it. Not just blocked, absorbed the impact with a forearm and pushed Chung back. A single motion, clean and practiced, like someone who had been blocking punches from creatures 10 times stronger than Gong Chung for the better part of a decade. The crowd went silent. Chung activated his class, Indestructible Demon Armor, a solid warrior-type ability that covered him in dark energy and dramatically increased his physical durability and strength. Then he charged. Chen switched to his Lightning Assassin class and hit him with a lightning-charged punch that sent Gong Chung flying. Not stumbling, not staggering, flying. One punch, full momentum transfer, the bully who had tormented him for years landing hard several meters away like a piece of discarded furniture. The crowd couldn't process it. This was Chen, the unawakened Chen. The Chen who got dragged to sinks and nearly drowned. The Chen nobody gave a second thought to. Chung got up, because people like Chung always get up when they have an audience, because their pride won't allow them not to, and charged again. Same result. Put down again, harder this time. His lackeys, watching their boss get systematically dismantled, did the math and made the only rational decision available to them. They left, quickly, without looking back. Chen stood over Chung, the fight effectively over, and for a moment, something dangerous passed through his expression. Not rage exactly, more like the cold calculation of someone who had been in too many real fights to have illusions about what mercy costs you. It was at that moment that Ling Yu, the student council vice president, stepped in. She was composed, unrattled by what she'd witnessed, which was already notable because what she'd witnessed should have rattled anyone. She acknowledged that Chung was at fault, acknowledged that the beating he'd received was technically justified, and suggested that continuing would cross a line from correction into something more concerning. Chen looked at her for a moment, actually looked at her, in the way that someone does when they're assessing rather than just seeing. He couldn't read her rank. Whatever she was something significant, the kind of person who looks completely calm in situations that shouldn't be calm. He let it go. He and Malong walked away while Chung's remaining lackeys, watching from a safe distance, quietly and collectively decided to update their threat assessments going forward. The dorm room that night was a study in contrasts. Malong, still electric from what he'd witnessed, tried to tell their other roommates what had happened. He recounted it with the enthusiasm of someone who had watched a superhero movie, but in real life. The block, the punch, the lightning, Chung flying through the air, all of it. His voice kept hitting new frequencies of excitement as he tried to convey the sheer impossibility of what he'd seen. Their roommates received this information with complete skepticism. Xiang Zuo, an E-rank nucleus mage who had appointed himself the intellectual authority of the dorm, explained why what Ma Long was describing was impossible. He was patient about it, almost condescending. If Chen had genuinely become a lightning assassin, why was he out there doing basic physical training like a common person? Real Awakeners didn't need to run laps with heavy backpacks. Real Awakeners trained in simulation environments or actual demon layers. The fact that Chen was doing something as mundane as physical conditioning was, to Zuo's mind, proof that nothing supernatural was going on. He also took the opportunity to remind everyone that the four of them were housed in this specific dorm because they were the weakest students in the academy. Bottom tier. He was, in his own estimation, the strongest of the four, which he acknowledged wasn't saying much, but it was something. And there was simply no world in which the person he'd been watching run laps in the rain had secretly become a lightning assassin capable of laying out Gong Chung. The gamer roommate Shan Yu agreed, in his low-energy way, that the whole story sounded like Malong had taken a significant blow to the head. Chen, eating quietly, said nothing. He wasn't performing humility, he just had nothing to prove to anyone in this room tonight. What mattered was tomorrow. What mattered was the rank test and what came after it, and the 3 years between now and the moment when wrath would descend and begin the chain of events that destroyed everything. He had work to do. The dorm politics could take care of themselves. Across the academy, the student council president was dealing with his own political situation. Gong Ting was, by any reasonable metric, exceptional. He was the youngest student at the academy to be involved with a guild at a serious level. His father had co-founded the Imperial Guild, the most prestigious in the country. He had resources that most students couldn't imagine. He had the kind of backing that turned talent into inevitability. He found his brother Chung sulking outside after the incident and listened to the full account with the patience of someone who had been managing Chung's disasters for years. Then he did what he always did, assessed the situation rationally, and decided what response was appropriate. When Ling Yu joined them at dinner and they discussed what they'd witnessed, the picture became more interesting. Ling Yu pointed out something important. There were fewer than 10 D-rank students in the entire school. Ting had recruited all of them already. For an outsider, someone with no guild connections, no access to demon layers, no real training opportunities, to have developed D-rank level strength without any of those resources was deeply unusual. Not impossible, just unusual. Ting filed the information away. He wasn't the kind of person who dismissed anomalies. He was the kind of person who monitored them. Meanwhile, his uncle, Gong Xuan, the Academy's director of employment, was already moving pieces on his own chessboard, preparing for outcomes that he preferred to engineer rather than leave to chance. While the dorm slept and the council plotted, Chen was outside. He'd set a target for himself that would have been ambitious for a professional athlete. 20 full kilometers carrying a bag loaded with 100 kilograms. Nearly twice his own body weight, worn on his back, over 2 laps around the full university grounds in the pouring rain. He ran it. Not because he needed to. His Awakener abilities had already pushed his physical stats well beyond what normal training could achieve through conventional means. He ran it because he understood something that most Awakeners, especially the ones who had come up through comfortable guild training programs, fundamentally missed. Basic physical conditioning was the foundation that everything else was built on. A stronger baseline body meant a higher ceiling for what Awakener power could actually do. The mechanics of it were simple. Power needed something to flow through, and the better the vessel, the more power it could handle. Elite guilds knew this. They just also controlled access to it, which meant that people like Chen, in his original life at least, had never gotten to actually apply it. He had 10 years of knowledge about how to build an Awakener properly. He intended to use every bit of it. As he ran, the memories came. They always came during long physical efforts, when the body was occupied enough that the mind wandered to places it usually kept locked. His sister's face the last time he'd seen her. Not the face she'd had when she was alive, full and warm and expressive, but the other one. The one after. The one that still appeared sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking. He pushed the pace harder. His sister was alive right now. She was probably studying somewhere, or competing in whatever competition she'd mentioned, or doing the 1,000 small things that made up a life that hadn't been interrupted yet. She was alive, and she didn't know what was coming. His job was to make sure she never had to find out. To make sure that in this timeline, the version of events that ended with her death simply never happened. That meant defeating Wrath before Wrath descended. That meant finding the specific demon lair where Wrath would appear and eliminating it before the gates could be opened. That meant becoming strong enough to kill a demon lord. 3 years. He'd had decades in his previous life and still barely managed it through self-destruction. Now he had 3 years and a completely different toolkit. He finished his laps, headed for the showers, sat with his updated status screen for a while, doing the math of where he stood and where he needed to be, before finally lying down to sleep. He didn't sleep long. When Chen closed his eyes that night, he found himself somewhere else, not dreaming, or at least not dreaming in any ordinary sense. The gluttony system pulled him into a space that existed within itself, a dimension contained in the power he'd absorbed, and at the center of it stood a tower. Massive, ancient feeling, built from material that looked like compressed darkness given solid form. It rose from a landscape that shouldn't have existed, stone and void, reaching toward a sky that had no sun but somehow provided light. Before he could examine it properly, monsters appeared. E-rank cloud warriors, what the system classified as death hounds. They came at him in a group, and Chen, reacting on instinct, switched class and dealt with them efficiently. Fast, clean, no wasted movement. The experience from the fights registered immediately. Level 2. Then the boss appeared, significantly stronger than the regular mobs but still within his current capability. And he dropped it without too much trouble. Level 3. But what happened after the boss fell was the moment that changed everything. The boss monster's body glowed. A prompt appeared in his system display with a word he'd never seen applied to a monster before. Devourable. He reached out, more instinct than decision, and activated it. The monster collapsed inward and became a card. A class card, representing everything that creature had been. Its abilities, its strengths, its fighting style, compressed into a form he could use. He stared at it for a long time. He'd known intellectually that gluttony worked this way, the system had told him, and he'd seen something similar from the Demon Lord side in his previous life. But knowing something intellectually and holding the physical evidence of it in your hand are different experiences entirely. He could do this. For every monster he could defeat, he could potentially gain a new class. There was no cap, no limitation, no ceiling. The only question was how strong the monsters were and whether he was strong enough to defeat them. An answer presented itself almost immediately, in the form of a demon that stepped out of the tower's entrance. S-rank. Immediately obvious. The pressure that S-rank beings exerted on the surrounding space was something you couldn't fake and couldn't mistake. 2 swords in its hands, each one radiating the kind of power that made the air around them feel unstable. Chen was D-rank. The gap between D and S was not a gap you bridged through cleverness or creativity. It was a gap that measured entire orders of magnitude of power. He summoned a lightning sword anyway, because he'd survived worse than hopeless situations, and because the demon seemed to know his name, which suggested this wasn't a random encounter. What followed was not so much a fight as a sustained education in the difference between knowing you're outmatched and experiencing it firsthand. The demon, the Purgatory Rakshasa, as it eventually identified itself, fought him without trying to kill him. It hit precise points. It knocked him down repeatedly. It observed his responses, his adaptations, the way he analyzed its movement patterns and began to account for them. The 0.4-second windup before each swing, the 0.2-second recovery lag after. Chen cataloged it all because that's what he did. That's what 10 years of survival had built into him, the reflex to extract information from pain, to turn every exchange into data, to find the window even in situations where the window was almost too small to see. He found the window. He used it. He hit the demon's heart with a precise strike that should have been impossible given the power differential, and then ran for the only light source visible in that space. The demon let him run. The light vanished. It had been an illusion. And then the Rakshasa did something unexpected. It talked. It told Chen what this place was. The tower wasn't a demon lair in any conventional sense. It was a sealed dimension, created by Demon King Lan Yu to contain the most powerful monsters he had devoured over a lifetime of accumulating power. The Rakshasa had been guarding it. That had been its purpose. But things had changed. One of the demons within the tower, a specific monster the Rakshasa declined to name directly, had massacred its entire clan, purely for entertainment. The kind of casual cruelty that only beings of enormous power can exercise, because ordinary cruelty requires you to actually care what happens next. The Rakshasa had been waiting for someone capable of vengeance, and now, looking at the human in front of it, the human who had somehow acquired the gluttony power, who had found this space, who had managed to actually wound it despite being several power tiers below, it believed it had found that person. Chen recognized the Rakshasa's appearance. He'd seen it before, in his previous life, during the final battle with Lan Yu. One of the Demon King's transformation forms had looked exactly like this creature, which meant the gluttony power he'd inherited contained, within its depths, a version of the Rakshasa itself. The demon confirmed this, offered him the Void Key, the only means of entering and exiting the tower freely, offered him its remaining power, to be absorbed and added to his own, asked, in return, for something simple. Become strong enough to kill every Demon King. Chen accepted without hesitation. The Rakshasa compressed itself into energy. Chen absorbed it. 8 levels, immediately. 2 S-rank blades materialized in his hands. New abilities unlocked. The capacity to absorb power from fallen enemies, both human and demon. Gravity manipulation. When he woke up the next morning in his dorm room, unharmed, his stats confirmed that none of it had been a dream. He'd jumped from level 2 to level 10 overnight. The real training hadn't even started yet. The walk home was quiet in the way that only walks with people you thought you'd lost forever can be quiet. Chen's sister Yun walked beside him, rolling her enormous suitcase with the practiced ease of someone who had been hauling their life around in luggage for long enough that the motion had become automatic. She was talking. She was always talking, in the specific way that people talk when they're comfortable enough with someone to not worry about whether every sentence is interesting, about her exams, about the competition she'd entered, about the rent situation, about 17 small things that made up the texture of a life being lived. Chen listened to every word, not performatively, not with the polite half-attention that people give when they're waiting for their turn to speak. Actually listened, with the complete and almost desperate focus of someone who had been denied this exact experience for 7 years and was now acutely aware of how finite everything was. Yun noticed. She had always been perceptive, sharper than she let on, in the way that people who are consistently underestimated by the world develop as a survival skill. She noticed that her brother was listening differently than he usually did. She noticed that he kept looking at her with an expression she didn't quite have a name for. She noticed that when she'd hugged him at the bus stop, or rather when he'd grabbed her and held on with the grip of someone surfacing from deep water, there had been something in that hug that was too large for the moment. She poked him, literally with her finger, in the ribs. "You're being weird," she said. "Did your crush reject you?" Chen almost laughed. The distance between that explanation and the actual truth was so enormous that it briefly created a kind of vertigo. "No crush," he said. "Then why are you looking at me like that?" "Like what?" "Like you haven't seen me in a long time." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the street ahead of them, the ordinary street, in the ordinary evening, in the world that was still intact and full of people who didn't yet know what was coming. "I'm just glad you're here," he said finally. Yun studied him for a moment with the expression she got when she was deciding whether to push a subject further or let it rest. She let it rest, but she didn't stop watching him. They walked. Their apartment was small in the way that apartments are small when the people living in them have been making financial decisions based on necessity rather than preference, for long enough that small has stopped registering as deprivation and started registering as just space. The kind of home that is entirely defined by the people in it, rather than any characteristic of the space itself. Yoon immediately began making ramen. This was a ritual that Chen had forgotten. Or rather, hadn't forgotten exactly, but had filed in the category of things that were true about his previous life and therefore no longer accessible. The specific way she moved around their small kitchen. The sounds of it. The smell that started as soon as the water went on. He sat at their small table and watched her, and felt something in his chest that didn't have a clean name. Somewhere between grief and gratitude, somewhere between the memory of loss and the present fact of her being here and alive and making ramen and complaining about the price of groceries. She set the bowl in front of him and sat across from him with her own. "Okay," she said, picking up her chopsticks with the focused energy she brought to all food-related activities. "Tell me what's going on." "Nothing's going on." "Chen, I'm serious. You hugged me at the bus stop like you were drowning. You've been looking at me like I'm going to disappear. You bought me." She glanced at the gold-plated pen sitting on the table between them, still in its packaging, because she hadn't quite allowed herself to open it yet, like opening it would make it more real, and therefore more at risk of being taken back. Something that costs more than our rent. So something is going on. He ate his ramen. She waited with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is more effective than pushing. "I've been thinking about things differently lately," he said finally. "About what matters." "What things?" "You. The future. What I want it to look like." Yoon's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but in the specific way that people's expressions shift when a conversation moves from the surface into something underneath it. She set her chopsticks down. "Are you in trouble?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Because the pen. I made a deal with someone," he said. "A business arrangement. It's legitimate." He paused. "Mostly." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone running probability calculations. "How mostly?" "Mostly enough," he said. "The rent for a year is covered. You don't need to worry about it." This landed with the impact of something unexpected. A year of rent was not a small number. A year of rent, handled suddenly and completely, represented a level of financial movement that didn't fit any version of Chen's life that Yoon had current information about. Her brother was a university student who, as far as she knew, hadn't even awakened yet. University students who hadn't awakened yet did not typically resolve a year of rent as a casual aside. She stared at him. He met her stare with the specific calm of someone who has already decided how much they're going to explain and is waiting out the interrogation. "Chen, Yoon, what are you doing?" "Getting stronger," he said. Simple, direct, without elaboration. She studied him for another long moment. The pen sat between them, gold and impractical, and exactly what she'd wanted. evidence of something she didn't fully understand yet. Then she reached across the table and patted his shoulder once, firmly. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "don't burn yourself out. That's my only rule." He looked at her hand on his shoulder, felt the weight of it, the real, present, alive weight of it. "Okay," he said. They ate their ramen. Later, after Yun had spent 2 hours making holographic drawings in the air with the new pen, which she claimed she was just testing, not enjoying, definitely not in love with, that would be ridiculous, and after she'd fallen asleep still holding it, Chen sat at the table in the quiet of their small apartment. He looked at her through the doorway. In his previous life, there had been a specific moment, not the moment she died, but a moment before that, when he'd realized he'd been so focused on surviving that he'd stopped protecting. That he'd gotten so caught up in the mechanics of staying alive that he'd let the actual reason for staying alive drift out of focus. By the time wrath descended and the real horror began, he'd been operating entirely on momentum, not for anything, just forward, because stopping was worse. He was not going to make that mistake again. He made a silent promise, not to her, because she was asleep and wouldn't hear it, but in the specific internal way that promises made to yourself in the quiet of important moments are made. She was going to get her dream school. She was going to have the life she'd given up in the original timeline to stay close to him. Every decision he made from now on was going to be made with that outcome as the non-negotiable constraint. Everything else was variable. That was fixed. He closed his eyes. He had work to do. The next morning, Chen walked into the Meathil Monster Exchange Center with the specific posture of someone who knows exactly what they have and exactly how much it's worth. The center was the kind of place that performed its own importance. High ceilings, polished surfaces, staff in uniforms that communicated authority and expertise. A place that had decided its architecture alone should communicate that only certain kinds of people belonged here, the kind of establishment that made ordinary people feel slightly apologetic for existing in the space. Chen walked in like he owned the floor. The broker who intercepted him was exactly the type of person that establishments like this produce. Efficient, assessing, mildly contemptuous by default. He looked at Chen and performed the instant calculation that people in his position perform constantly. Who is this? What do they have? And is it worth my time? Chen placed the fang from the beast Sangan monster on the counter. The broker examined it with the practiced skepticism of someone who handles low-quality items regularly and has developed a fine-tuned performance of not being impressed. E-grade material, limited value. Their exchange operated on a VIP system. They dealt in D-grade and above. He was sorry for the inconvenience, but their time was valuable, and this particular item wasn't the kind of thing that was going to... Chen placed the great sword on the counter. Everything changed. The sword that the Purgatory Rakshasa had carried, one of 2 weapons Chen had received when he absorbed the demon, was not an item that existed within normal commercial categories. The broker's assistant, who had been standing slightly behind her superior with the expression of someone trying to remain professionally invisible, leaned forward. She had a good eye. She didn't know what she was looking at exactly, but she knew it was significant. The broker tried to maintain his previous posture. He said it was probably B-grade at best, possibly A-grade if she was feeling generous, but A-grade items were worth around $1 million, and in his years of experience, he'd never actually encountered one in person, so... The shop owner arrived. He looked at the sword the way people look at things that require a different category than the one they're currently using. He said, with the calm of someone who has seen a great many things and is now seeing something past all of them, that the weapon originated from the Purgatory lands. It was S-grade. The broker's internal systems essentially rebooted. The assistant's professional composure evaporated entirely. The owner took Chen's hands in both of his with the warmth of someone who has just identified exactly which conversation they are about to have and is very pleased about it. He invited Chen into the VIP room. He asked what Chen needed. Chen told him, not to sell the sword, to use it as collateral for a loan of $1 million, to be repaid in 30 days, with interest the month after. The owner, Qing Ji, whose name Chen knew because in his original timeline this man had become one of the most significant commercial figures in the country, looked at him for a long moment. He was doing the math. He was also doing something past the math, reading the person in front of him, the way that people who have survived long enough in high-stakes commerce develop the ability to do. He asked if Chen was certain about the graduation test, because he clearly knew about it. He'd done his homework before this conversation even started. Chen said yes. Qingji looked at him for another moment. Then he smiled, the specific smile of someone who has just made a decision they feel good about, and said he would lend him 1.5 million. No interest. The additional 500,000 was a gesture of goodwill at the beginning of what he expected to be a long and mutually beneficial relationship. He extended his hand. Chen thought about what he knew about this man, the guild boss who would become a major figure, who had figured out the entire situation in the time it took most people to say hello, and who had still chosen not to use that information as leverage. He shook the hand. The contract was completed in minutes. The money moved to his account before he left the building. On his way out, Qingji offered to loan him a weapon for the tournament since he'd just used his as collateral. Chen summoned the second great sword, the other one from the Rakshasa, and watched the assembled guild staff have a collective moment of stunned silence. He thanked Qingji, walked out. Behind him, Qingji immediately promoted the assistant who had correctly identified the sword as significant before anyone else did. While Chen was conducting financial arrangements, the student council president was receiving a visit from his father. Gong Lin was the kind of man who had the particular stillness of someone who had accumulated enough power that they no longer needed to perform it. Co-founder of the Imperial Guild, one of the most influential figures in the country. He arrived at the academy, and the staff treated his presence the way medieval court members treated a visiting monarch. Carefully, deferentially, with the specific anxiety that comes from being observed by someone whose opinion of you has material consequences. He had come for the graduation assessment. His son's graduation assessment, specifically, the culmination of everything Ting had been building toward since the moment Gong Lin had started directing resources toward making his son exceptional. The conversation between them happened in private, but the outline of it was readable in the way that family dynamics are always readable to people who pay attention. There were expectations. There was a vice chairman of the World Guild Alliance who had been personally invited to observe, Carl Cavendish, a man whose name was known globally and whose attendance at a student graduation assessment was so anomalous that it had required significant relationship capital to arrange. The family name was on the line. Not just reputation, actual institutional standing. Gong Lin's position within the structures of power that governed how the guild world operated was connected, in ways both visible and invisible, to his son's performance at this event. Ting received all of this with the composure he always displayed in his father's presence. He said he had not shown his full strength during the assessment. He said he would dominate the graduation exam without assistance. He said this with the confidence that had always served him well. What he didn't say, what he was still processing internally, was that there was now a variable in the equation that hadn't existed a week ago. A variable with no guild connections, no training resources, no combat experience by conventional measures, who had somehow produced readings that broke the measurement equipment and was now apparently planning to compete independently in the same difficulty tier. He kept this to himself, but his uncle, Gong Xuan, the academy's director of employment, who had been quietly listening to the family discussion, had already started moving pieces. Gong Xuan was a careful man. He operated in the space between official policy and personal interest with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that the boundary between the two had become genuinely unclear to him. He looked at the graduation assessment situation and identified a problem. The problem was Chen. Specifically, the possibility that Chen's performance, whatever it actually was, error classification notwithstanding, might somehow interfere with Ting's trajectory. Ting needed to be the clear standout of this graduation class. He needed the vice chairman's attention, his father's satisfaction, the Imperial Guild's unambiguous endorsement. A wild variable producing incomprehensible readings and then refusing to join the president's team was not helpful to this agenda. The solution Xuan identified was elegant in its simplicity. The rank display system that organized students for the team selection process could be adjusted. Rankings could be moved. If Chen's displayed rank was placed at the very bottom of the class, below even the weakest students, in the position reserved for those who technically qualified to participate but barely, then no team would voluntarily recruit him. Without a full team, he couldn't compete. Without competition, the outcome was settled. He made the adjustment quietly, and with the confidence of someone who believed the target had no recourse. He was not accounting for Chen being the kind of person who had already anticipated that this kind of move was possible, who had already started thinking about how to respond to it, and who was not particularly interested in playing by rules that had been designed to exclude him. The morning of team formation arrived with the energy of a marketplace, students everywhere, assessing each other with the calculating eyes of people who understood that the composition of their team directly impacted their outcomes, moving through the space with the specific social physics of people trying to maximize their position. The display system showed every student's rank, organized from highest to lowest. It was meant to be a neutral tool, transparent information that allowed efficient team construction. Chen's name was at the very bottom, below every E-rank student. Below people who had barely registered on any measurement scale. Below students who had come to the assessment and produced results so minimal that the equipment had struggled to classify them at all. The crowd noticed immediately. The murmuring started. How was this possible? The person who had, by most accounts, equipment malfunction or not, produced the most dramatic readings in the history of the ceremony, was now displaying as the least capable student in the entire graduating class? Something was wrong. Either the original readings had been a complete fabrication, or something was being done to the rankings, or there was a misunderstanding so profound that it had somehow produced the exact inverse of the truth. Malong looked at the display, and then at Chen with the expression of someone who recognizes a pattern they don't have the vocabulary to name yet. Chen looked at the display and recognized exactly what had happened and who had done it. He looked across the room at Director Gong Xuan, who met his eyes briefly with the expression of someone who believes they have successfully closed a door. Chen looked back at the display. Then he thought about the academy rule that he knew existed, a rule that had been part of the institutional structure since the school's founding, designed to create competitive dynamism in an environment that otherwise tended toward calcification. The rule that said any student could challenge any other student to a demonstration of strength at any time, and that the results of such demonstrations were publicly visible. He thought about the fact that Gong Ting could not, refuse such a challenge, not with his father present, not with the vice chairman watching, not without the refusal being visible to everyone as the kind of thing that the strongest student in the academy simply didn't do. He activated his lightning ability. Just a fraction. Just enough to be visible. A crackle of electricity at his fingertips. Controlled and deliberate. Announced to the room with the specific body language of someone who is about to make a point. The officials at the assessment stations turned. His dorm mates looked at him with wide eyes, understanding that something was happening but not yet fully understanding what. And then a voice cut through the gathering tension from the direction of the door. Does he still need someone for his team? Ling Yu walked in. The vice president of the student council, the woman who had watched the entire rank assessment ceremony from above, who had told the principal afterward that this year would be interesting, who had clearly been doing her own calculations about what she'd witnessed, walked through the door and looked directly at Chen. She said she'd reached D rank back in middle school. She said she wouldn't disappoint him. She said she wanted to compete in the graduation assessment. The room went through several reactions simultaneously. Chen's dorm mates made sounds that conveyed various levels of disbelief. Chung and Ting looked at each other with expressions that suggested this development was not part of any plan they'd constructed. Director Xuan nearly choked on whatever he'd been drinking. Students who didn't know who she was started asking immediately. Those who did know started explaining to those who didn't. Exchange student, Saint Kingdom, D rank since middle school. No record of rank tests at this academy. Rumors only, but the kind of rumors that accumulate around someone genuinely worth paying attention to. The director recovered and moved quickly. He pointed out, with the smooth urgency of someone trying to close a situation before it develops further, that exchange students couldn't participate in the graduation assessment. Rules were rules. She hadn't taken ranked tests at this academy. She hadn't proven her rank here. The regulations were clear. He said this, looking at the principal, expecting agreement. The principal, who had been watching from above with the expression of someone who has seen all of this kind of thing before and finds it mildly entertaining, appeared from exactly where he hadn't been a moment ago, with a movement that Chen clocked as something other than a basic warrior class ability. He acknowledged that the director was technically correct. Then he asked why an exchange student would want to participate in the school's graduation assessment when she'd only be here temporarily. He addressed this to Ling Yu directly, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer and was giving the conversation space to arrive there naturally. Ling Yu played along. She said he made a fair point. The principal shifted his tone and looked at the director. He said that the purpose of this school was to support awakeners in achieving great things. He said the graduation assessment was one of the most important moments in a student's life. He asked that if a student was prevented from participating due to rule changes implemented after they'd enrolled, how exactly the school intended to make up for that loss. Director Schwan began sweating in the specific way that people sweat when they realize that the thing they thought was private has been observed. He backed down, gracefully enough, in the external performance of it, while internally making a series of adjustments to his threat assessment of what this situation had become. He announced that teams with fewer than 5 members and lower-ranked students could participate as well, effective immediately. The 4 dorm mates looked at each other. Then they looked at Chen. Then they hit confirm on the terminal. They were in. The final element of preparation was dungeon selection. Each team captain chose which difficulty tier their team would attempt. The point multipliers were significant. F-rank dungeons capped at 75 points, E-rank at 100, D-rank at a theoretical maximum of 150. The highest score in Academy history was 90 points, achieved by the person who currently led the Imperial Guild. Chen's tablet dinged before anyone else had made a selection. He had chosen the D-rank dungeon. The room received this information in stages. First, silence. The specific silence of people processing something that doesn't fit their existing categories. Then Malong asked if he'd bumped his head. Then Zuo made a sound that conveyed the complete absence of words adequate for the situation. Then Shan Yu looked up from his device for the second time in as many days, which was itself a significant event. No team had ever cleared a D-rank dungeon. Not in the history of the assessment. Not professional teams, not guild-backed students with years of real combat experience, not anyone. The D-rank tier existed in the selection system because the option technically had to exist, but in practice, it was a category that students looked at and kept scrolling past. Attempting it wasn't ambitious. It was irrational. Chen explained, with the patience of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply providing context, that he had thought about it carefully. That simulation training, which everyone else would spend their remaining preparation time on, was essentially useless for what actually happened when you entered a real dungeon for the first time. That the only training that mattered was training that forced the body to develop real instincts. His dorm mates looked at each other. Then Ting's tablet dinged. The president had also selected the D-rank dungeon. His team immediately confirmed, 10 strong, D-rank all represented. The crowd erupted. 2 teams attempting the impossible. One of them composed of the Academy's finest, with years of guild-backed training. The other composed of 3 E-rank students being carried by one person who may or may not have broken the measurement equipment through sheer power. Ting stood up. He looked at Chen directly and said, with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact rather than making a threat, that the top position belonged to him. That there was room for only one strongest student at this academy. Chen turned and faced him. The 2 of them looked at each other across the room, with the specific quality of people who have identified each other as the actual problem that needs solving. Ling Yu, watching from the back, felt something she identified as unease. She knew what a D-rank dungeon actually contained. She knew what it asked of the people who entered it. She knew the gap between what Chen's dorm mates were capable of and what the dungeon would require of them. She hoped Chen knew what he was doing. The principal, beside her, watched both young men with something that looked like pride. He was fairly certain that whatever happened in that dungeon was going to be worth watching. The gap between dungeon selection and the actual graduation assessment was 2 weeks. For most teams, those 2 weeks looked like simulation training. The academy had dedicated facilities for it, environments that recreated dungeon conditions with reasonable accuracy, letting students practice their abilities against virtual opponents in controlled settings. It was safe. It was structured. It produced measurable improvement in specific technical skills. Every elite team used it. Chen made his dorm mates do physical training, not simulation, not controlled environments, not anything that involved a screen or a virtual opponent or a safety net. He made them run. He made them carry weight. He made them move through obstacle arrangements that trained explosive response, the kind of full-body instinctive reaction that you can't build in a simulation because simulations don't actually hurt you when you fail. Zuo complained about this for approximately the first 3 days before his body stopped having the energy to complain and simply began adapting. Malong understood the reasoning faster than the others. He'd seen Chen move in the alley. He'd been watching his roommate's capabilities recalibrate his expectations for weeks now, and he had developed a trust in Chen's judgment that was rooted in evidence rather than sentiment. Shan Yu adapted with the particular philosophical acceptance of a person who has spent significant time in games and understands, on some level, that grinding is just grinding. You do the work. The numbers go up. That's how it works. Chen explained it to them one evening when they were all on the ground, thoroughly exhausted, looking at the training field ceiling with the glazed expressions of people who have temporarily lost the ability to feel their extremities. Simulation trains your skills, he said. It doesn't train your body to stay alive when your brain shuts down. Zuo turned his head toward him with enormous effort. My brain has already shut down. That's the point, Chen said. When you enter that dungeon and something comes at you faster than you can consciously process, what saves you isn't your skill level. It's what your body does automatically. That's what we're building. Malong stared at the ceiling. When you enter a real dungeon for the first time, Chen continued, the first thing that happens is your mind goes blank. Everything you practiced, everything you planned, everything you thought you understood about how you'd respond, gone. The only thing left is instinct and reflex. We're making sure those instincts are worth something. Silence. Then Shan Yu, still flat on his back, said, That's actually terrifying. Yes, Chen agreed. That's also the point. While his dorm mates recovered from daytime physical training, Chen went somewhere else entirely. The void tower that existed within the gluttony dimension had become his actual training ground. Every night, when his dorm mates were unconscious and the academy was quiet, Chen closed his eyes and returned to the tower. The fallen star wastes, the dimension connected to the first floor, operated under gravity 10 times stronger than Earth. Every movement cost 10 times the effort. Every mistake carried 10 times the consequence. Every step forward was a negotiation with a body that was being crushed from every direction simultaneously. The phantom lions that populated the space were B-rank monsters. In normal gravitational conditions, Chen's current power level would have given him a meaningful advantage against them. In the fallen star wastes, the conditions erased that advantage entirely. The lions had spent their entire existence in crushing gravity. They had evolved for it, adapted to it, built their fighting style around it. They moved through the Tenji environment with casual efficiency that made Chen feel, on his first attempts, like someone who has been handed a piano and told to fight with it. The first sessions were brutal, in a way that didn't translate well to any description that didn't involve being physically present for them. Chen got mauled, repeatedly, by lions that were faster than him, more adapted than him, fighting in conditions that they owned and he was still figuring out how to exist in. He found approaches and the lions countered them. He developed adaptations and the conditions negated them. He switched between classes. His abyssal fiend form gave him strength and durability that partially compensated for the gravitational disadvantage, while the Rakshasa's gravity manipulation ability allowed him, in moments of precise concentration, to create local distortions that briefly leveled the playing field. He leveled up, incrementally, repeatedly, through the grinding accumulation of fights that he sometimes lost but always learned from. By the end of the first week, he could reliably handle a single phantom lion without being pinned. By the end of the second week, he could handle 3 simultaneously. When the graduation assessment arrived, he could hold his own against an entire pack under bone-crushing gravity, with blood on his face and the specific expression of someone who has been pushed to a limit and found that the limit had moved. He had never looked more prepared to win anything in his life. The graduation assessment day arrived with the particular atmosphere of an event that had accumulated significance before it even began. VIPs were present in numbers that transformed the Academy's observation areas into something resembling a formal venue. Gong Lin, Ting's father, the Imperial Guild co-founder, moved through the space with the gravitational field of the extremely powerful, drawing attention and deference without appearing to seek either. And then the white limousine arrived. Carl Cavendish stepped out of it with the unhurried composure of someone who moves through the world at a pace that the world adjusts to, rather than the other way around. Red-haired, immaculate. The vice chairman of the World Guild Alliance, whose organizational scope covered every major guild operating on the planet. Students lost their composure entirely at the sight of him. People of Cavendish's stature didn't appear at student graduation assessments. They appeared at international guild summits. They appeared when countries were making policy decisions about Awakener deployment. They did not appear at an academy in the middle of the country to watch students attempt dungeons. The question of why he was here hummed underneath everything that followed. Chen's dorm mates arrived in matching outfits. Malong's idea, executed with the sincere enthusiasm of someone who believes that coordinated presentation communicates something important about team cohesion. They looked, against all reasonable expectation given who they were and what they were attempting, genuinely prepared. Wristbands went on. The exam officially began. The dungeon Chen's team had selected was officially designated a D-rank cloud forest lair. The name communicated precisely nothing about what was actually inside it. What was actually inside it was a frozen nightmare dressed up as a forest. Massive trees coated in thick ice rose around them the moment they stepped through the entry portal. The air hit with the specific cold of places that exist at temperatures that human bodies treat as fundamentally hostile. Light filtered through ice-coated branches in ways that were visually striking and practically disorienting. The reflections and refractions created a landscape that looked different depending on where you were standing and which direction you were looking. And then the ghost monkey bats arrived. They came from above, descending in a flock with the supersonic precision of monsters that had evolved to hunt in exactly this environment. Bat wings folded for speed, primate bodies built for impact. The specific combination of two different kinds of terrible, fused into something worse than either component. Chen had warned them. He'd said specifically that these monsters dive at their targets in the blink of an eye. He'd said keep your eyes open. He'd said react. They reacted. Not perfectly, not with the fluid competence of trained fighters who had faced this before. They reacted with the awkward, desperate, full-body commitment of people who had spent 2 weeks training their instincts for exactly this moment and were now discovering whether it had worked. It had worked. Not because they dodged beautifully, they didn't. Zuo stumbled. Malong made a sound that was technically a word but conveyed primarily alarm. Shan Yu went sideways in a direction that was more fall than dodge. But they moved. They got out of the way. The monsters passed through space that had contained them a fraction of a second earlier and hit nothing. They looked up. Chen was standing in the clearing with a lightning sword in hand, surrounded by ghost monkey bat corpses. He'd been eliminating them while his team was busy surviving. The bodies were already cooling on the frozen ground. Focus on staying alive, he said. Leave the rest to me. What happened next was not something Chen had planned for, exactly. He'd planned for his team to survive and stay out of the way. He'd planned for their physical training to keep them from dying in the first 30 seconds. He hadn't quite planned for them to decide that survival wasn't enough. A ghost monkey bat came from behind while Chen was occupied with the main group. It targeted Malong, the weakest visible target, as monsters tended to do, and moved with the speed that made these creatures so dangerous in this environment. Zuo caught it. Not cleanly. His flame-type nucleus mage abilities weren't built for direct physical interception. But he got his hands on the creature's leg with the desperate commitment of someone who has decided that this particular outcome is not acceptable, and he held. He shouted at his dorm mates. Specifically, he shouted at them to stop acting like dead weight. He said Chen wasn't the only one with a graduation on the line. He said this with the fury of someone who has been underestimating himself in public for long enough that the accumulated resentment of it has found a specific, physical target. Malong cast his Frostbite Breeze Cloud chant. It slowed the monster. Shan Yu cast his Vine Lock Flora chant. It restrained the monster briefly. The creature broke free almost immediately. These were D-rank monsters, and a combination of low E abilities could only do so much, and kicked Zuo hard enough to make him briefly airborne. But the window it had created was real, and Zuo landed and immediately charged up everything he had. Nuclear burst flame bullet. The first shot barely scorched it. The second did slightly more. The third, the fourth, the fifth, each one individually inadequate, but each one contributing to a cumulative effect that the monster's regeneration couldn't quite keep pace with. Zuo gathered everything he had left. Every drop of mana, every ounce of concentration, everything that 2 weeks of training and a lifetime of being told he was bottom tier had somehow not managed to eliminate from him. Converged burst flame bullet. The explosion was significant enough that Chen, occupied with the remaining members of the main flock, felt the pressure wave. When the smoke cleared, a charred skeleton was what remained of the ghost monkey bat. The drone announced it. D-class monster eliminated. The three of them collapsed onto the frozen ground simultaneously, completely drained, making sounds that were technically still human but only barely. Then they started laughing. The specific laughter of people who have done something they genuinely weren't sure they could do. The laughter of exceeded expectations. Chen walked over and looked at them. Then he said, with something in his voice that the dorm mates wouldn't quite have words for but would remember clearly, "Good." The dungeon's final level opened into a frozen wasteland, flat white extending in every direction, the kind of emptiness that makes you feel both exposed and trapped simultaneously. In the center of it, the ghost ape was eating. It was enormous. The scale of it hit Malong first, because he was the one looking directly at it, and the scale of it produced a specific biological response that bypassed his decision-making entirely. He screamed. The ape looked up. Chen moved before anyone else could react, launching himself at the creature with the focused intensity of someone treating this as exactly the kind of combat problem he'd been solving for years. He connected, juggled its body through a combination of rapid strikes, and finished it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who found D-rank boss monsters genuinely disappointing as a challenge. Then he noticed the hollow tree trunk, full of mana stones. Giant, glowing, clearly valuable mana stones that the ape had apparently been hoarding. His dorm mates saw them at the same moment he did. "Wait," Chen said. They touched the stones. The Arctic blast that erupted from the mana stone trap sealed everything in ice instantaneously. Shanzu, Shanyu, the drones, the entire area. The trap had been set by the dungeon's actual final boss, a monster designed not to fight fairly, but to fight smart. Malong was the only one standing. His Cloud Chant class came with a passive resistance to ice-based abilities. It had saved him from the initial blast almost by accident. He stood in the frozen landscape, looking at his encased dorm mates, and then heard a laugh that came from the direction of something he was not prepared to look at directly. The Bone King emerged. Cloud Mage type, C rank. A skeleton-like creature that manipulated ice and cold with the casual mastery of something that had spent its entire existence in exactly this environment. It enjoyed killing slowly. The monster compendium entry that Malong vaguely remembered from his reading described it as deriving particular satisfaction from prolonged suffering. The ice bomb trap wasn't a combat opening. It was an aperitif. Malong ran. Not away from the dungeon, toward Chen's encased form, trying to thaw him out, trying to reach the one person who could actually deal with what was coming. He didn't make it. An ice shard hit his leg. The bracelet on his wrist registered the injury and offered him the option to abandon the exam. He declined. Another shard hit his arm. The bracelet escalated its warning. His heart rate was in dangerous territory. The pain was significant enough that the biological case for stopping was becoming very compelling. He thought about the fact that he had spent his entire life running away from things that were hard. He thought about the look on Chen's face when he'd told them they were going to win together. He stood up. He got to Chen's ice prison. He started working at it. His hands, his chant, everything he had, while the Bone King watched with the amused patience of something that had all the time in the world. Then the Bone King got bored of watching and launched a barrage. Malong didn't move. He kept working at the ice. The barrage came toward him, and he opened his mouth and roared. Not with any particular power, not with any combat ability, just with the sound of someone who has decided that this is the line and they are not moving past it. Chen's eyes opened. The ice prison shattered. Chen burst out, gathered Malong, and moved them both clear of the incoming attack in a single fluid motion. He looked at Malong. The wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. The bleeding had slowed. Malong was conscious and coherent enough to give him the relevant information. C-rank Lair Lord, Cloud type, Bone King, extremely dangerous. Do not get frozen again. Chen looked at the Bone King. Then he switched class to the Doomflame King and activated Cloud Warrior Frost Body. Complete immunity to cold damage, enhanced resistance in cold environments. The battlefield that the Bone King had built over decades of freezing everything it touched. The advantage it had constructed specifically for this encounter, inverted in an instant. The Bone King shrieked. Malong watched his roommate, who had been a lightning assassin, then a Doomflame King, and was now switching again, and said quietly, mostly to himself, that Chen had 3 different classes. Not 1, not 2, 3. each one in a completely different tier of power. Chen switched to Abyssal Fiend, drew the Purgatory Rakshasa sword, looked at the Bone King with the expression of someone solving an arithmetic problem. He hit the ceiling of what the dungeon could threaten him with. He'd reached it in his previous life, eventually. It just took longer then. In this life, with everything he'd accumulated, a C-rank Lair Lord was an obstacle in the technical sense only. Something that required being addressed before he could continue, not something that actually threatened the outcome. He moved. The strike was clean. One motion, full power, the Abyssal Fiend's strength multiplied through the Rakshasa sword's S-rank resonance. The Bone King's skeleton, ancient, powerful, built from millennia of accumulated ice magic, separated into its component pieces cleanly. Level 17. Rare loot drop. Malong stared at the scattered remains. "You one-shot a C-rank Lair Lord," he said. "The others are still frozen," Chen reminded him. Malong sprinted off to thaw them, running with the urgent energy of someone who has just remembered that their other friends exist. Chen looked at the Bone King's remains. Then he used Gluttony. The absorption completed. The Cloud Mage class added to his collection. The drone coverage in the area had been eliminated by the Arctic Nova attack, which meant no one watching from outside had seen the devouring. Convenient. In the VIP observation room, Director Gong Xuan had been watching the feed from Chen's team with the barely concealed satisfaction of someone who expects failure and is waiting for it to arrive on schedule. The Mana Stone trap had produced exactly the outcome he'd anticipated. Frozen students, one panicked survivor, a C-rank Lair Lord that no reasonable collection of E-rank students had any business being in the same space as. The feed had gone dark, the drones eliminated by the Arctic Nova, and he'd taken that as confirmation. He'd started preparing his expression of appropriate regret. Then the feed came back. The Bone King was gone. The frozen students were being thawed. Chen was standing in the center of the wasteland looking at his bracelet, with the expression of someone checking a time. 20 minutes from entry to full clearance. Xuan's carefully prepared expression became temporarily unavailable. On the other side of the monitoring system, Ting's team in the Gloomvine Grotto had been fighting the D-rank Vine boss for what had felt like an eternity to them but was, in practice, exactly 30 minutes and change. They cleared it through coordinated effort, Ting's blazing Sky Sever finishing what the rest of the team had been setting up. They came out celebrating with the energy of people who have done something genuinely difficult and know it. They walked into the hallway and found Chen's team already sitting there. The student who had dismissed Chen as a failed graduate student who'd gotten lucky with a broken machine, the same person who had taunted him before the exam, called him a fraud, demanded compensation for the destroyed demon heart, looked at the 4 dorm mates sitting calmly in the hallway and performed a rapid and unflattering calculation. He started to say something condescending, something about how they'd obviously been eliminated immediately and teleported out early like most of the other teams. Then Carl Cavendish walked past him. The vice chairman moved with the deliberate pace of someone who has identified what they came to see and is now going to acknowledge it properly. He stopped in front of Chen. He gripped his shoulder, a gesture that was simultaneously personal and public, the kind of gesture that carries weight precisely because of who is making it. He said, "For everyone present to hear, that Chen had cleared a D-rank dungeon in 20 minutes. He said that not even professional teams from his own guild had managed that. The silence that followed had a specific texture to it, the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people receive information simultaneously that requires them to update something fundamental." Gong Ting stood very still. His 10-person team, composed of the best-trained students in the academy, the ones with guild backing and real combat experience and years of coordinated practice, had cleared the same tier dungeon in 30 minutes. A 4-person team composed of people that the Academy's own ranking system had placed at the absolute bottom had beaten them by 10 minutes. Cavendish turned to Gong Lin. He said Ting was talented as well. He said it in the tone that people use when they're giving a compliment they've decided to give for social reasons, rather than because it's the most important thing they have to say. A half compliment. The kind that contains its own diminishment simply by existing next to something more genuine. Gong Lin's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted by approximately 2 degrees. Cavendish announced that he was leaving. Director Xuan moved quickly to manage the moment, announcing the final results, noting that both teams had produced exceptional performances, declaring that both would receive Imperial Guild invitations. The prize money would be split evenly. Chen's dorm mates received this as the best news they'd ever heard. Imperial Guild, direct recruitment. Their entire future, delivered in a single sentence. Chen looked at the split prize and did math. $500,000. His debt to Qingji was $1.5 million. He needed $1 million more. President Gong Ting looked at the tied result for approximately 3 seconds. Then he said he didn't accept it. He said it quietly, without particular heat, with the specific certainty of someone who has decided something and is now simply stating what they've decided. He said there could only be one strongest student at this academy. He said a 1 versus 1 duel would determine who that was. He said the winner would take the entire prize. The room, which had been settling toward a conclusion, immediately unsettled. Director Xuan moved toward his nephew with the urgent body language of someone trying to prevent a second disaster before the first one had fully processed. He said quietly that a tie was the best possible outcome. He said accepting it was the wise choice. He said the situation had already been managed well enough. Ting looked at him with the expression of someone who has stopped listening. Cavendish, who had been heading toward the exit, paused. Chen said yes. Not after deliberation, not with any visible hesitation. He turned around from where he'd already started walking and said yes, with the condition that the winner took the full $1 million. The vice chairman stopped completely. He looked at the two of them, the guild heir who had spent his life being built into a weapon by institutional resources, and the person who had appeared from the bottom of the ranking list and cleared a D-rank dungeon faster than any professional team on record, and made a decision. He canceled his departure. His assistant leaned close to him and said quietly that Chen's presence reminded him strongly of someone. An old friend, by the way he said it. Someone whose name he didn't say out loud. Cavendish looked at Chen. He said, to himself more than anyone else, "Remember that name." The two of them stood facing each other across the space of the hallway. Ting with his guild backing, his years of preparation, his father watching with expectations that had the weight of institutional investment behind them. Chen with his dorm mates, his gluttony power, his 10 years of compressed experience, and the specific motivation of a man who watched the world end once and came back to stop it from happening again. The dorm mates looked at each other. Malong, arm bandaged, walking with a slight limp from the ice shards, having just been through one of the most intense experiences of his life, looked at his roommate with an expression that was somewhere between trust and the specific acceptance of someone who has stopped being surprised by what Chen was capable of. Zuo looked at the situation and said nothing, which was itself a form of commentary. The principal, watching from above with Ling Yu, said that he hadn't expected it to go this direction. Ling Yu said that she had. She looked at Chen with an expression that was difficult to read. Assessment, concern, something past both of those. She knew what Ting was actually capable of. She knew the gap between the performance he'd given during the rank test and his real strength. She knew that C rank was genuinely significant, that the real Ting was meaningfully more dangerous than the one the Academy had on file. She also knew, from watching what Chen had done in the dungeon, from watching the machine die, from watching the sky change, that she still didn't know what Chen's actual ceiling was. Nobody did, including Chen. Chen stood in the hallway and looked at the person across from him. He thought about 3 years. He thought about Wrath descending. He thought about gates opening. He thought about the sequence of events that, if nothing changed, would eventually produce the world he'd already lived through. The one that took everything, left him alone, ended with a mutual detonation in the dark. He thought about his sister drawing with a holographic pen in their small apartment, tears drying on her face from a song she hadn't expected to feel anything about. He needed that $1 million. He needed the guild access it represented. He needed the position and the resources and the room to move that first place in this assessment would provide. He needed to win. He looked at Ting. Ting looked back. The duel that would determine which of them was the strongest student in the Academy's history was about to begin. And somewhere above them all, in an observation room where a vice chairman of the World Guild Alliance was re-evaluating why exactly he had been invited here and what he had actually found, a name was being committed to memory. Chen. A name worth remembering. A name that the world was going to hear again.